Yes, it's John, back in the studio, Sunday morning rant. And I know it's been a couple of weeks since the last one went up, and I make no apologies, it is going to be a little bit sporadic for the sort of foreseeable future. And once things have calmed down elsewhere, I will explain what's going on. So, those of you who want to, bear with me. Those of you who don't, well, not a lot I can do about it. So, we are back in the studio. I have actually been in the studio doing stuff again. You can see my D70 has made its way back into the studio. I have actually been using it. I do so love the road. There's a Rhodes patch on the D70 that I absolutely love. Hence the reason why it keeps sort of morphing backwards and forwards. But it's a really great keyboard to play, and it's got a lovely feel on it. Apart from the fact one of the keys has developed a fault, and it's actually, funny enough, it's right down the bottom there, and it's in the last octave. So I don't use it very often. I don't play up in that range very often, so I don't use it very often. But it's developed a fault. There's it's very difficult to describe, but what Roland do is they had like a metal leaf spring underneath their keys, and that leaf spring has become detached. And I've no idea how it's become detached, but it's become detached, and it's not effectively triggering the key to come back to its full upright position properly. So I'm probably going to have to take the whole keyboard to pieces, take the keyboard to pieces, and put a brand new spring in there. Now, I have actually bought brand new springs. It's just one of those jobs that I will get around to at some point when I have a little bit more time with everything else that's going on. Anyway, this week, following a conversation with my friend Bruce, I've decided to do a little piece on keyboards overheating. Now, where this sort of conversation started was that Bruce came across a video of somebody with a Korg SV1. So those of you who don't know what a Korg SV1 is, it's a, I don't know whether it's a 76 or an 88 key, but it's Korg's sort of stage piano, and it's got a valve preamp on it. And the guy whose video it was saying basically he was having problems with the SV1 firing up and then freezing on him, and he was struggling with playing it live at the moment because he was so frightened that he'd get it on stage, be in the middle of a live set, and all of a sudden, boom, it would just freeze, and the only thing he could do is switch it off, wait a couple of minutes, and switch it back on. And then he made a load of comments about how hot a certain part of the keyboard was getting, and he was basically saying that if you imagine you've got your keyboard and you're looking at it, keys in the front, and over here he had the power supply coming in, and he was saying that was visibly hot to touch, and he didn't know whether that was a manufacturing fault. Well, guess what, buddy? That is a fault. You know, no keyboard should get that hot. If you have got a keyboard getting that hot, you've got a problem. So let's have a look at why you might get a keyboard, or a keyboard might get that hot. So let's first look at what in a keyboard will cause heat. And invariably, the thing that will cause heat in a keyboard is any sort of power board where you're stepping down a mains voltage to a voltage that the keyboard will work on. Now, typically keyboards work on a DC voltage of between 5, 10, 12, 15 volts, etc., depending on what components are in your keyboard and depending on how it's been designed by the manufacturer. So over this power board here, this is my 240 volt main supply, and that will be stepped down via a series of components on here, and I'm not going to go into the detail of that, to over here where we would have the rail voltages, which on this particular keyboard I can't remember actually off the top of my head, but there are the various plugs of the rail voltages that go off to the various components in the keyboard. Now there are a number of components on this board that can cause heat. So transformers can cause heat because what's actually happening on a transformer is the alternating current is being stepped down, and that has a heat, can have a heat dissipation associated with it. Then what you have is a number of components which include these capacitors here, which are designed to take that AC voltage and transform it into a DC voltage, or a direct current, which is what the keyboard will operate on. And then you'll notice that there are some very big things with heat sinks on them. And these are typically voltage regulators. And what they're designed to do is ensure that the voltage that is going out on these pins here is the voltage you're expecting it to be. Because if the voltage varies quite a lot on these pins here, you can end up frying the internal circuitry of your keyboard, and we don't want that. So what happens is these things here, they will dissipate voltage in terms of heat. Now, one of the biggest things that happens on a power board is either the transformer goes faulty, or more than likely the capacitors start to break down. Now in a legacy keyboard, these things are getting on for 30, 20, whatever years old, and you have to be mindful that these will start to break down at some point. As they start to become less efficient, there is more reliance placed on the voltage regulators. They have to work harder, they have to dissipate more heat, you get a lot more heat. Now the layout of my T1 is such that the power board sits here, and then you can see there is a lot of free space around the power board, and all the electronics that run the keyboard are that way. So this is an 88 key keyboard. There's the first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So the first 8 keys are here. So there's another 80 keys of space, effectively, that away where all the electronics are. There's a lot of space in here for heat to dissipate. Now if you go and look at some of the more modern keyboards and some of the smaller keyboards, there is not so much space in those for the heat to dissipate. So of course power supplies come in all different shapes and sizes. So this is probably more familiar to people who've got some modern keyboards, where a lot of modern keyboards now effectively don't take mains power in the back of them. What they do is they take a lower voltage supply. So there's your transformer for something like that. This is not actually for a keyboard, this is for something else, but it just happened to be on the floor in the studio for me to pick up readily. And again, if these things are getting really hot, then your device is pulling more current, and that's what these things are doing, is trying to dissipate the heat by servicing the amount of power that your device needs. So rule of thumb is, would be try and buy a power supply that can give more power than you require. Not a lot more, but more power than you require. So hopefully these things don't cook. Now, so going back to the SV1 issue, why might this guy have his keyboard cooking? Well, you've seen inside the T1, and I talked about where the power supply was and where the rest of the gubbins was in the T1. So the T1's quite a cavernous space. Lots of heat can dissipate in there. It doesn't get vastly hot. You definitely can't feel it on the keyboard, on the casing to the touch. Now, legacy keyboards worked in one of two ways. If it was really old and it had valves in it, it was going to get hot. Okay, because valves require heat. Well, valves, no, that's not true. Valves get hot because of the way they work, in terms of you've got electrons floating around in there hitting surfaces, and they tend to glow hot. And those sort of devices also tend to have mains voltage on them. So 110, 100, 230, 240, depends on where you are in the world. So you'd expect those to run hot, and the circuitry that was running with those sort of things would typically be designed to run hot as well. But then you get onto the sort of when the digital electronics came along. Well, it might even be an analog keyboard, but there still was some electronics going on in there. And those sort of devices would typically be designed to work at a lower voltage. So you have to have something to step it down. You looked inside the T1, you saw a power board in there. That was designed to step it down. And basically, if the power board gets hot, then it can heat the electronics up. But the electronics back in those days were fairly simple. Okay, it's not like a modern keyboard. A modern keyboard, say for example this Kronos that's just sitting down here, or the Jupiter which is sitting over here, are computers. There is no if, buts or maybes. This is a Linux kernel, that is a Linux kernel. Both of them have computers in there. This has a hard drive in it. It has RAM in it. For all intents and purposes, I could take the motherboard out of here, load a different operating system up on it, and it would act as a computer. Probably wouldn't do things very well because it's designed for music, but it is a computer at the end of the day. And if you see videos of people taking the Kronos to pieces and you look at the actual motherboard, there you will see a CPU, probably with a heatsink sitting on top of it, and USB ports and bits plugged into it and hard drives and the whole 9 yards. It's a computer. Well, the only difference between this and a PC is that this thing has specialist I/O boards on it designed for music. These things are more susceptible to heat, okay, and they will typically have some sort of thermal cutout, and the more expensive of older keyboards will also have thermal cutouts in them. And if it's too hot, basically what happens is the thermal cutout kicks in, it cuts the power off to allow the keyboard to cool down. That doesn't help if you're on stage, of course. So if you're on stage, your keyboard cuts out, having to sort of like go to the public and say, oh, I'm sorry, but we're gonna have to take a 10-minute break because the keyboard's too hot. Doesn't really work. So anyway, going back to the video of the SV1 was all about the guy saying it was getting really hot and he was worried about it, and the bottom line was get it back into get it to a service centre PDQ because there's something wrong. And again, with one of these things like this sort of Kronos, if I felt that the power supply, which just happens to be this end, if I felt that was getting really, really hot, then I would start having to look at why was it getting hot. Is this thing pulling too much power? Which it shouldn't be, because I mean at the end of the day the power supply is way overrated in the Kronos for what it is, what it's drawing. Or is there some other issue going on which is causing the power supply? And I would say probably in legacy stuff, the reason why your power supply is starting to get hot is because something like you've got a capacitor that's on its way out, or a diode that's on its way out, and the voltage regulators are having to work really, really hard to keep that voltage in your keyboard stable. It's one of the reasons why a lot of people talk about recapping. Okay, so people would recap a power supply board to put brand new capacitors in there that they know are going to operate within their range of operation. So what am I saying really? What I'm saying is, if you've got a keyboard that is running toasty hot, I mean, to the point where you could probably put your eggs on there, if I were you, I'd get it to a service centre. I wouldn't muck around, because the longer you leave these things getting hotter and hotter and hotter, at some point you're going to have a failure. And if it's something that fails and starts pumping voltage down the rails into the fine circuitry that is running this thing, that's it, your keyboard is kaput. So this is sort of what I was trying to say really at the beginning, is if it's running hot, get it looked at. Now, I'm not going to say anymore. what I am going to say is thanks for listening. See you next time. Bye-bye. So this is the point in the video where I turn around to you and say, if you enjoyed the contents of this video, please give it a thumbs up. It allows other people to find this content more easily that you have enjoyed. I'm sure by now, if you didn't like the content of the video, you've probably given me a thumbs down, but I'd prefer if you didn't. If you'd like to be notified about when I post additional content to this channel, somewhere about here should be the subscription icon. So please click on there and subscribe to the channel. Over here should be other content that you may enjoy that I've already done or posted to the channel. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again.